Chapter 3: The Ice That Should Have Died. Author's note: I am not a writer, just taking my second step into creating fanfiction. I heavily use ChatGPT, so if there's anything wrong or things I should add, inform me so I can fix it. The late afternoon sun stretched across the docks of Kalos, reflecting off the water in streaks of gold and bronze as small waves lapped lazily against the hulls of research submarines tied to rusting moorings. The scent of salt and machinery mixed thickly in the air, carrying with it the faint tang of hydraulic oil and the acrid tang of solder from the maintenance sheds. Workers moved about in small groups, wiping sweat from their brows or leaning against rails to catch glimpses of the harbor beyond, but most of their attention had drifted toward the large display mounted on a crane's scaffolding, the kind normally used for inspecting hull integrity or reviewing schematics. Today it replayed footage from the Alola deep-sea expedition, a glowing window into another ocean altogether, far from the tides and currents of their own home waters. The broadcast hummed with the narration of oceanographers describing strange, almost miraculous phenomena unfolding hundreds of meters below the surface, though the workers themselves approached it with the same casual amusement they would offer a traveling carnival, some leaning in with curiosity, others shrugging, laughing at what they assumed were theatrics designed to impress tourists or sponsors. Rhea Solane crouched near a half-disassembled submersible, her hands streaked with grease and tools laid out meticulously on a nearby workbench, the mechanical heartbeat of her world grounding her against the spectacle of the broadcast. Her Glacian sat beside her, fur glinting faintly in the waning sunlight, ears twitching at the distant calls of seabirds and the low hum of engines from the repair docks. She barely spared the screen a glance, more concerned with the torque of a faulty joint and the alignment of the pressure-resistant hull than with the distant narrative of explorers pushing through alien depths. A few loose sparks from a soldering iron caught in her periphery, and she flicked her wrist with precise irritation to brush them aside, glancing only briefly at the dark shapes gliding across the monitor as if she were observing fish swimming past the hull of her submersible rather than witnessing an event the world would call monumental. Her mind catalogued measurements, energy outputs, and hydraulic pressures, not the drama of the Vaporeon descending into the inky void of the Alolan Trench. From behind her, a voice called out, teasing and faintly incredulous. "Hey, Solane, come see this. Doesn't this look like one of those rich Alola scientists just showing off?" A few workers laughed, nodding at the glowing screen where the submarine's descent was replayed over and over, the water darkening with depth and tension. Rhea straightened slightly, gripping the edge of the hull for leverage as she allowed her gaze to drift toward the broadcast, not for the spectacle, but for the engineering data scrolling along the edge of the overlay, depth readings, pressure markers, hull stress estimates. She noted, almost without thinking, the subtle shift in pressure at 10 meters. Not dangerous for the craft, not even remarkable for trained submariners, but something about the readings made her instinctively pause. Her Glacian moved closer, ears swiveling toward the soft clicks and hums of the sonar and telemetry, as if sensing her focus and sharing the weight of the moment in quiet solidarity. "It's standard," she muttered under her breath, more to herself than to anyone else, her hands still occupied with tightening bolts and checking sensor calibrations, though attention threaded through her fingers she couldn't entirely shake. The dock workers' chatter rose again, a mixture of jokes about extravagant funding, exaggerated fear of the dark ocean depths, and mild disbelief at the glowing forms twisting beneath the submersible's lights. "Bet that Vaporeon's got more pressure resistance than half the Pokémon we see around here," one quipped, nudging a coworker as if to underscore the absurdity of a normal creature surviving where even the metal hull creaked in protest. Another laughed, shaking his head, "Or it's CGI. There's no way that's real." Rhea, still kneeling, ignored the banter. To her, the broadcast was not entertainment, it was a series of puzzles in motion, a complex assembly of conditions she could measure, replicate, and perhaps even understand. She adjusted a panel, noting a slight misalignment in her sub's fin stabilizers, her mind already running through torque ratios and hull integrity charts while the world outside marveled at what they imagined to be spectacle. Her eyes lingered on the telemetry tickers just long enough to memorize the subtle environmental cues: water temperature, minor stress vibrations along the hull, currents brushing against sensors. Each fragment of data built a mental blueprint, a quiet promise that she would return to this later, when the harbor emptied and only the hum of machinery and the steady presence of Glacian remained as witnesses to her meticulous observations. The moment the broadcast deepened, the ambient chatter at the docks shifted to a low murmur, tinged with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. The Alola submersible had begun its steady descent, and the water on screen grew darker, colder, almost oppressive in its depth. The dock workers leaned in instinctively, their casual amusement fading as the depth indicators climbed past 10 meters, small red warnings blinking faintly alongside the telemetry. One worker's Gyarados twitched nervously, tail lashing against the dock rail as if the Pokémon could feel the unseen pressure through the screen. A Tentacruel perched nearby, usually indifferent to noise and commotion, recoiled, its appendages curling defensively as though it, too, sensed an alien weight pressing down from the dark water. A shiver passed through the crew, though none of them could explain it, the strange instinctive warning barely registering in their conscious minds. Meanwhile, Rhea remained crouched near her submersible, the tools in her hands momentarily forgotten as she tracked the numbers flickering across the broadcast overlay with meticulous intensity. 10 meters. 10 meters, exactly the depth at which most Pokémon would instinctively avoid lingering, where physiological limits began to demand attention. She murmured softly, almost mechanically, "Pressure changes everything," the phrase more observation than philosophy, though it would later anchor her obsession. Her Glacian shifted beside her, ears flattened and body low, watching the monitor with a quiet, almost protective unease. The broadcast reached the critical moment, and the on-screen Vaporeon trembled, its smooth body beginning to show signs of collapse under conditions no Pokémon should have endured. The dock workers, ignorant of the exact thresholds, gasped collectively, some nudging each other and laughing nervously as though to stave off disbelief. "That can't be real," one muttered, squinting at the glowing form as it buckled under invisible forces. Look at the way it's folding in on itself," another added, a mixture of awe and fear threading through his voice. But Rhea did not see spectacle. She saw a body under extreme stress, joints and fins straining against an environment that should have been survivable only in theory. She replayed the footage several times, her trained eye scanning for mechanical errors or inconsistencies in the submersible's instrumentation. The depths were not extraordinary, the currents and pressure were within the safety margins she knew well. Yet the Vaporeon's response, its collapse, the subtle fractures forming along its form, defied all known biological limits. She felt her chest tighten, a professional curiosity laced with unspoken dread, but she refused to let disbelief cloud the data. Her fingers traced invisible lines along the recorded depth readings, marking every minor fluctuation as though by doing so she could reconcile what she was seeing with what she knew to be possible. Then it happened. The tremors and fractures coalesced into a sudden transformation, the Vaporeon's form rippled, the water around it pulsing faintly with bioluminescent light as new shapes emerged. Abyssian. The creature stretched into a long, sleek silhouette, fins elongating with terrifying grace, eyes glowing faintly in the dim light of the submersible's lamps. The dock workers erupted in disbelief laughter, nervous shuffling, and murmured reassurances that someone must have staged it, that cameras and effects had tricked them all. One shouted, pointing at the screen, "That's CGI. They're using some kind of projection." But Rhea said nothing. She watched, silent and analytical, replaying each second over and over, eyes flicking between depth, pressure, and physiological response. Her mind raced. The evolution had not been planned, at least not in any way she could imagine. This was no experiment, no controlled study. It was raw, chaotic, and terrifying in its spontaneity. And yet there was a pattern beneath the chaos, a logic written in the way the creature's body adapted to the crushing pressure, its bioluminescent veins spreading along its streamlined form in perfect harmony with the deep-sea environment. Her Glacian, sensing the weight of her attention, pressed close, tail brushing her arm, ears swiveling toward the eerie quiet that had settled over the dockside. Rhea's lips parted, just slightly, as she whispered again, more to herself than anyone else, "Pressure changes everything." But this time, the words carried a heavier weight, one that hinted at the obsession already beginning to take root deep within her mind. The broadcast ended, leaving only the residual glow of screens reflecting off tired faces and scattered machinery. The dock workers returned to their routine, exchanging nervous jokes and muttered disbelief, as if shaking off the experience could erase it from memory. Rhea, however, remained crouched where she had been, her eyes fixed on the frozen frames of Abyssian gliding through impossible depths. She scribbled notes feverishly, depth readings, pressure fluctuations, submersible responses, and environmental factors that should have made the evolution impossible. The number 10 meters, the exact depth where the initial collapse began, was circled repeatedly on her page, as though she were trying to anchor reality itself to that datum. Glacian rested its head against her knee, watching silently, a quiet reminder that the stakes of deep-sea pressure were not just academic. "Pressure changes everything," she murmured again, and this time the phrase resonated differently. Not as a casual observation, not as a technical note, but as a philosophical hinge, the seed from which an obsession would grow. In that moment, with the world above continuing as if nothing had occurred, Rhea Solanae resolved, perhaps without knowing it, to understand what had happened down in the abyss, to replicate it, and to confront the impossible reality she had just witnessed, whatever the cost. The docks had emptied almost entirely by the time Rhea allowed herself to linger, the last of the casual chatter fading into the rhythmic lapping of water against the hulls of small research submarines. The glow from the monitors cast a cold, blue sheen across the scattered tools and coiled hoses, illuminating the faint steam of her breath as she leaned closer to the screen, notes sprawled across the metal workbench in front of her. Every frame of the broadcast had been frozen, slowed, and annotated: depth, temperature, submersible hull integrity, Vaporeon's muscular response, and the subtle undulations of Abyssian's bioluminescent stripes, all logged meticulously. Her hands moved with mechanical precision, fingers tracing lines and scribbles, circling numbers that seemed to anchor the impossible in the realm of reality. 10 meters. That number had burned itself into her mind, a simple datum that nevertheless carried the weight of every law of biology and physics she thought she understood. Every instinct whispered that something had gone wrong, that the creature should not have survived, and yet it had. And the subtle, undeniable truth that it had adapted in a way she could not yet define fueled a spark of obsessive curiosity that made it impossible to look away. Glacian watched her silently from beside the workbench, its ears flicking occasionally toward the distant hum of machinery, but otherwise still and patient. Its own discomfort during the broadcast had been palpable, body tensed, ice forming faintly along its fur, as if it could sense the crushing pressure even from this distance. Now, it simply observed, an unspoken reminder that the deep held forces both awe-inspiring and dangerous. Rhea absent-mindedly reached out, letting her fingers brush its icy head, drawing comfort from the familiar weight of its presence. "Pressure changes everything," she whispered again, the words now carrying a resonance that was both technical and philosophical, a bridge between her practical understanding of mechanical stresses and the gnawing intuition that life itself could bend to the environment in ways no textbook had ever predicted. She paused, pen hovering over paper, and considered the implications. If a Vaporeon could be driven to adapt or something beyond adaptation by pressure, then perhaps her understanding of evolution, of survival under extreme conditions, was incomplete. Perhaps she was looking not at an anomaly, but at a natural law that had simply never been witnessed before. The thought sent a shiver through her, not of fear, but of exhilaration. The abyss was teaching her something, and it demanded to be observed carefully, rationally, and secretly. Her notes became a labyrinth of data points, calculations, and conjectures, each one branching into further questions. She compared Abysseion's posture at 10 meters with pressure tolerance tables she had memorized for various Pokémon, charting the minute angles at which fins and tails bent under stress. She calculated theoretical water displacement and friction, the torque on the joints, the limits of cartilage and bone. Nothing suggested that a Vaporeon could endure the environment it had just experienced, yet there it was, alive or at least functionally coherent in a way that mocked her calculations. She scribbled down the exact depth, repeated it, and underlined it 3 times, 10 meters. The simplicity of it struck her with more clarity than any elaborate formula. It was a threshold, a trigger, a point where the ordinary rules failed. She stared at the number long enough for the ink to blur slightly, feeling the pressure of the abyss pressing down through her eyes, through the walls of the dockside building, into her mind. And she felt a strange, stubborn refusal rising in her chest, a denial of the obvious. The Vaporeon had not merely changed, it had survived something that should have killed it. Somewhere beneath that survival lay truth, and she would uncover it even if it meant bending her own principles, even if it meant testing the limits of life itself. The night deepened, shadows pooling around crates and the edges of the dock, and still Rhea remained. Tools lay abandoned in precise clusters, charts, and monitors forming a chaotic mosaic of data. Glacian shifted closer, tail brushing her arm, sensing the growing intensity of her focus. She whispered softly, almost to the Pokémon, almost to herself, "Pressure changes everything, and maybe it can change you too." Her words carried the weight of hope, of fear, and of denial intertwined. She refused to consider the possibility that some limit had already been reached, that life had been lost, and that she had witnessed the precipice of death rather than its triumph. All she saw were numbers to study, conditions to replicate, and a path forward that demanded action. The obsidian waters of Alola's deep had shown her a secret, and she would not leave it unexplored. The abyss had begun speaking, and Rhea Solanae, mechanic, engineer, protector of her Glacian, had decided she would answer, no matter the cost. The small workshop smelled of ozone and wet metal, the faint tang of salt from the nearby harbor lingering in the air. Rhea sat cross-legged on the floor, monitors arrayed around her like sentinels, each one looping clips from the Alola broadcast in staggered sequences. Unlike the casual viewers at the docks, she was not interested in spectacle or story. She sought patterns, numbers, anything that could explain how the impossible had occurred. Her fingers were streaked with grease and chalk from hastily written equations on the laminated charts she had taped to the floor. Glacian sat quietly beside her, tail curled neatly around its paws, eyes following every motion of her hands, ears twitching at the hum of the computers. Even it seemed to sense the shift in Rhea's mindset from curiosity tinged with awe to an obsessive, almost clinical analysis. She began with pressure readings, isolating every frame of the descent where sensors reported depth and force against the submarine hull. The numbers, on their own, told a story of gradual increase, nothing outside the expected tolerance of both the machinery and any normal marine life. Yet in the footage, Vaporeon's movements betrayed unease, subtle flexes and flicks of its fins that hinted at muscular stress beyond what the data should have allowed. Rhea paused the recording, leaned close to the screen, and sketched lines along its spine and tail, calculating leverage points, stress angles, and potential deformation under extreme force. Her Glacian leaned forward, nose twitching as if it could feel the pressure transmitting from the screen itself. "This shouldn't be possible," she murmured aloud, though the words sounded more like an incantation than an admission. It was not just the evolution that baffled her, it was the survival that preceded it. Temperature, too, told a story of subtle extremes. The water column was colder than typical shallow zones but within expected deep-sea parameters. Currents fluctuated, though barely enough to disturb the submersible's orientation, yet Vaporeon's behavior suggested that even these minor perturbations had a physiological effect. Rhea traced the currents on her maps, noting the points where turbulence intersected with stress responses. She calculated the kinetic energy transferred to the Pokémon with each pulse, multiplying by the body's mass and factoring in its structural limits. Her notebook filled with numbers and arrows, a web of logic attempting to catch a creature whose existence mocked conventional reasoning. Each calculation tightened the knot in her chest. The pressure should not have been lethal. If anything, the submersible's design should have shielded the Pokémon entirely from harm. And yet, the footage did not lie. Vaporeon had collapsed before her eyes, then almost instantly Abyssinian emerged, streamlined and silent, adapted to conditions that had proven fatal to its prior form. Rhea ran the calculations again, slower this time, watching as the numbers stubbornly refused to account for the outcome. She isolated variables: time submerged, exact depth, stress indicators, minor temperature shifts, and plotted them against known biological thresholds. Nothing matched. Not one theory aligned with the observed behavior. And yet the transformation had occurred, violently, irreversibly, and without pretense. Her engineer's mind recoiled at the lack of a mechanical explanation, and for the first time, the stirrings of denial crept in. Perhaps it hadn't died at all. Perhaps survival had occurred through a process so alien, so extreme, that her instruments and her mind could not yet comprehend it. Hours slipped by, unnoticed. The workshop lights dimmed to a soft glow, the hum of the monitors and the distant slap of waves against the docks marking the passage of time. Rhea rechecked her calculations, double-checked her diagrams, and even began experimenting with hypothetical models, layering pressure curves over simulated Pokémon physiology. Her Glacian nudged her hand gently, a soft reminder of the life it carried now, the life that would soon be tested. She ignored the pang in her chest, focused instead on the numbers. Survival or not, there was a pattern here, and she would find it. Denial, she realized with a slow, sinking thrill, was already a necessary tool. Accepting failure or death would only slow her pursuit. If pressure could change everything, then maybe it could change life itself. And if life could change, then she would need to see it happen with her own eyes. Rhea leaned back in her chair, her eyes burning from hours staring at screens that flickered faintly in the workshop's dim light. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitating, almost reluctant to dive into the next layer of the puzzle. She had the numbers, the pressures, the impossible behavior of Abyssinian, but raw data alone wasn't enough. She needed context, she needed people, and most of all, she needed answers to the questions no one seemed willing to ask. Her mind went back to the broadcast, to the fleeting moments where the submarine shivered under the abyssal pressure and Vaporeon's body betrayed the impossibility of its own survival. The technician in her recoiled at the sheer chaos of forces at play, but the engineer, the part of her that trusted hands-on knowledge, pushed forward. She began with the scientists involved in the dive. The name Dr. Isandro Cade appeared repeatedly in reports and press blurbs, always associated with experimental submersibles, extreme pressure research, and unusual deep-sea anomalies. But the deeper she dug, the stranger it became. His official biographies listed ultra-deep energy phenomena, a field that seemed more like theoretical physics than anything marine. Publications cited cosmic pressure anomalies, dimensional overlaps, and predimensional energy fields that apparently had nothing to do with actual oceans. And yet, here he was, orchestrating dives in Alola's trenches, sending Pokémon where no ordinary creature could survive. Rhea's eyes narrowed as she traced his career timeline, the gaps growing more conspicuous with each click. Every publicly available paper was meticulously detailed until it wasn't. Entire years were omitted, conference appearances erased from the record, research grants quietly retracted. It was as if someone had scrubbed the man's career clean in selective bursts. The most alarming discovery came when she reached his current status. Official records, stamped and signed by multiple oversight bodies, labeled him as removed from active research reason, insubordination. No further explanation. No scandal, no misconduct, no accident. Simply, removed. Rhea frowned, leaning closer to the screen, reading the line over and over. Insubordination. To whom? About what? And why had such a figure been allowed to continue leading a deep-sea expedition involving creatures capable of lethal transformation? Her engineer's instincts screamed that there had to be a reason, a technical cause buried beneath bureaucratic euphemism. She noted every anomaly in her journal, missing years, revoked funding, mysterious fieldwork that seemed almost otherworldly. Her Glacian pressed against her side, a small warmth in contrast to the cold, clinical glow of the monitors. It nudged her hand, but she barely noticed, lost in the threads of secrecy she was beginning to unravel. Rhea's hands clenched around the edge of her desk. Something about Cade's removal, his focus on extreme phenomena, and his presence in Alola didn't add up. There were too many coincidences, too many gaps, and the pattern of deliberate obfuscation suggested the dive and whatever had happened to Vaporeon was more than a freak incident. Someone didn't want the truth known. Her practical mind began to race. If the numbers didn't lie, and the Pokémon had collapsed under pressure in a manner that defied survival, and yet evolved in the process, then Cade's presence or at least his influence was a critical piece of the puzzle. The idea was uncomfortable, but necessary. This wasn't just about biology or physics. Someone, somewhere, had engineered or at the very least anticipated the conditions that forced the evolution to occur. And if that were true, then what she had witnessed in Alola was not just a freak accident. It was controlled chaos, and she had been watching from the sidelines, a mechanic among scientists, trying to rationalize something that had already defied every rule she knew. By the time she powered down her monitors, the room was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigeration unit and the occasional drip of seawater from her submarine's hull repairs. She rubbed her eyes, feeling the beginnings of a headache behind her temples. There was missing data, unexplained phenomena, and a human element shrouded in secrecy. All of it pointed to one truth she could not yet face aloud: if Abyssian's emergence had been unplanned, then someone had deliberately hidden the evidence, and someone had classified the event as unremarkable. Rhea scribbled a final note in her journal: need full dive telemetry. Missing last 10 minutes. Something's being hidden. She tapped the pen against the page, staring at the words as if the act of writing them might somehow compel the universe to answer. The practical engineer in her wanted to understand forces and failures, but the mechanic, the woman who repaired what others left broken, was beginning to feel the stirrings of something more dangerous: denial wrapped in obsession. The next step was clear: she had to see it herself. Rhea stared at her screens with a sinking feeling, the mechanical rhythm of her hands at the keyboard doing nothing to soothe the growing unease in her chest. She had expected gaps, small, understandable omissions in publicly released scientific footage, but this was deliberate. Entire sections of the dive telemetry were gone, scrubbed from public archives as though someone had intentionally erased the moments when the impossible had occurred. She scrolled through endless folders, finding metadata pointing to deleted files, corrupted timestamps, and segments labeled only as classified, restricted access. Her fingers trembled slightly as she tried to reconcile what she saw with what the broadcast had shown. The final minutes of the dive, the ones where Vaporeon collapsed under pressure and transformed into Abyssian, simply weren't there. Only vague summaries remained, tucked into official reports that avoided any meaningful analysis, leaving gaps wide enough for speculation, fear, or deliberate denial. Every technician, every engineer, every casual observer in Kalos had witnessed it at least in fragments, but the official record was sterile and empty, as if the abyss had swallowed the event itself. Rhea's Glacian moved to her side, pressing its head against her knee, and she barely noticed, her eyes locked on the flickering screen displaying the last surviving frames of the descent. Pressure readings that should have been fatal, temperature logs that suggested near impossible survival, subtle stress indicators in Vaporeon's physiology all vanished in those missing minutes. It made no sense, and yet the absence of data spoke volumes. Someone had wanted her, and everyone else, to see only what was convenient, to witness a controlled narrative rather than the chaotic truth. The mechanic in her recoiled at the thought that systems could be manipulated in this way, but the practical mind, the part that trusted measurable forces over speculation, couldn't deny the evidence. It was gone, intentionally, and the consequences of that omission weighed heavily on her conscience. Her journal quickly filled with scrawled notes and diagrams, the ink smudging from the dampness of her sleeves as she traced the missing timestamps and reconstructed what could be inferred from the fragments that remained. She noted the depth at which the Vaporeon had faltered, 10 meters. The number glowed in her mind like a warning. That depth was shallow for the kind of physiological stress recorded, yet it had been enough to shatter the Pokémon's form. She ran mental simulations of pressure, hull integrity, and temperature gradients, over and over, trying to rationalize what she had seen. Each run ended with the same impossible conclusion: the collapse was not survivable. It should not have been survivable. And yet, the Pokémon had persisted, had evolved, had existed in some form beyond the bounds of life. The absence of data was a puzzle piece too glaring to ignore. Ria's practical instincts fought with a growing emotional undercurrent, denial she barely recognized yet clung to. The thought that Glacian could endure a similar trial, that any experiment she attempted could repeat the impossible she had witnessed, gnawed at her. She refused to accept that Abyssian's transformation was an accident. She refused to accept that the forces she was studying could defy nature on such a scale without intent. If the data had been removed, it meant someone had known, someone had been controlling it, and perhaps she could replicate it herself, under controlled conditions she trusted. The idea coalesced slowly, insidiously. She would not wait for approval, she would not defer to scientists, administrators, or league protocol. If the truth was hidden, it was her responsibility, her alone, to bring it to light, even if it meant bending every rule she had ever followed. By the time the room had grown silent and the hum of the monitors became almost hypnotic, Ria had made her decision. She would reconstruct the dive herself. She would replicate the pressures, the temperatures, the conditions exactly as they had occurred in Alola. She would observe, record, and verify. She would not fail. And she would not let anyone or anything stand in the way of understanding. Her Glacian blinked up at her, head tilting with cautious curiosity, but she didn't notice its subtle unease. In her mind, the impossible was now a mechanical challenge, a puzzle to be solved, a truth to be grasped. The missing data was no longer a void, it was a map, pointing her toward the abyss she would soon descend into herself. The hum of the repair bay was low and constant, a mechanical heartbeat that mirrored Ria's own racing pulse. She crouched over the small research submarine she had been restoring for weeks, her hands streaked with grease and her uniform damp from hours of bending over cables, welding joints, and recalibrating pressure valves. Every inch of the vessel had been inspected, tested, and reinforced to withstand the unusual depths she intended to reach. It wasn't designed for the crushing pressures of the Alola abyss, but it was enough to reach 10 meters safely, or so the calculations promised. She ran her fingers along the sleek hull, tracing the contours of the reinforced frame, and imagined it sliding quietly into the darkened water, carrying her and her Glacian into the unknown. She was a mechanic, not a scientist. The numbers, schematics, and simulations were her language, but intuition guided her more than theory. Every bolt she tightened and every panel she adjusted felt like a conversation with the machine itself, a silent promise that it would hold under strain. Outside, the night had fully settled over the dockside, and only the occasional glow of distant lamps lit the otherwise black waters. Ria ran one last series of simulations on the onboard sensors, feeding in the pressure readings, water temperature, and descent rates from the Alola dive. The numbers aligned almost perfectly with what she had observed in the broadcast. A small thrill ran through her, not of awe, but of professional satisfaction. This was engineering verification, she told herself. A controlled test, nothing reckless. She repeated the simulation, watching the data flicker across the console. Pressure gradients, oxygen levels, hull stress, all within tolerances. Every calculation nudged her closer to certainty, reinforcing the belief that she could witness the impossible again and understand it from a grounded, mechanical perspective. She ignored the tight knot forming in her stomach, the premonition of the abyss waiting for her below. Thal'Nyxion padded into the bay with quiet curiosity, tilting its head at the submarine as though it could sense her nervous energy. Its soft blue fur shimmered faintly under the overhead lights, and Rhea absent-mindedly ran a hand over its back, feeling the warmth against her grease-stained palm. She hesitated for a moment, watching the quiet vigilance in its eyes. Normally calm, Thal'Nyxion's ears twitched slightly, and it let out a low, uncertain sigh. Rhea told herself that this was just a reaction to the unfamiliar mechanical smells and the late hour. The creature would be fine, she reasoned. They both would be fine. This wasn't an adventure. It wasn't reckless. It was procedure. She double-checked the containment harness, the life support readings, and the communication links, methodically ticking off the final checklist. Every technical detail was accounted for, the unknown would be manageable. Finally, she stood back, wiping her hands on her coveralls, and gave the submarine a long, measured look. The bay smelled of ozone and metal, a scent she had come to associate with both creation and risk. She imagined the vessel slipping into the water, descending slowly, quietly, toward the point where pressure began to define existence itself. The mechanical mind in her was confident. She could monitor every gauge, every reading, every movement. She could control the environment. Nothing could go wrong. And yet, beneath that certainty, a part of her buried, unacknowledged, almost instinctual felt the pull of the deep. It was a cold, silent tug, like the ocean itself whispering warnings she refused to hear. Thal'Nyxion stepped closer, brushing against her leg, and she reached down to stroke it one last time before they departed. "We'll be fine," she murmured, almost to convince herself as much as it was to reassure her partner. The submarine's lights flickered, the engines hummed to life, and the bay seemed to shrink around them, holding its breath in anticipation of the descent that would change everything. The submarine eased away from the dock, the cables and tethers releasing one by one as the engines hummed with controlled precision. Outside, the water swallowed the faint glow of the surface, and the colors of the bay drained into a deep, uniform gray. Rhea's hands rested lightly on the controls, her eyes scanning the sensors for every nuance of pressure, temperature, and current. The instruments ticked steadily, numbers dancing across the displays in rhythm with the submarine's slow descent. She had been meticulous in her preparations, double-checking every gauge, every seal, every hatch. The machine beneath her was sound, sturdy, and capable, she reassured herself repeatedly, even as a shiver of anticipation traced her spine. Thal'Nyxion crouched in its harness beside her, ears flicking toward the distant, muffled sounds of the deep, its body tense but obedient. As they descended, the light grew scarce, replaced by shadows that pressed in from every direction. Rhea felt the familiar tug of water against the hull, a quiet resistance that intensified with depth. The pressure sensors ticked upward, rising incrementally but well within the thresholds she had confirmed in her calculations. Still, the sensation was different in reality than on paper. The walls of the submarine seemed to lean closer, the hum of the engines stretching in her ears, and the water around them moved like a viscous curtain, muffling sound and light alike. Thal'Nyxion's tail twitched nervously, and Rhea glanced at her partner with a half-smile meant to soothe both of them. "It's just deeper than usual," she said, voice low, almost conversational, though she knew that neither words nor reason could erase the uncanny quiet pressing against them. The ocean darkened further, the faint bioluminescent flickers of small deep-sea life occasionally dotting the murky expanse beyond the reinforced windows. Rhea checked the readouts, pressure rising steadily, oxygen stable, hull stress within limits. Nothing unsafe. Nothing that should pose any real threat. Still, Thal'Nyxion's ears flattened slightly, and a soft, almost imperceptible whine escaped its throat. The creature's body shivered subtly, the fur along its spine rippling in the dim glow of the instrument panels. Rhea reached over to place a hand on Glacian's shoulder, squeezing reassuringly, and whispered, "It's fine. Just a bit of new water, that's all." Yet beneath her reassurance, a seed of unease had already planted itself. The reality of the deep was heavier than numbers alone, the environment tangible in a way that no schematic could capture. Finally, the depth indicator blinked, 10 meters. 33 feet. The number that had haunted her since the Alola broadcast. It sat there on the display, innocuous and precise, yet somehow monumental. Rhea exhaled slowly, the first time in hours that her muscles loosened, and her eyes met Glacian's luminous gaze. The Pokémon's body tensed further, subtle cracks forming along its crystalline fur, invisible yet sensed through the tiny fractures of ice already beginning to form. Rhea's heart constricted at the sight, but she dismissed the pang of alarm almost immediately. This was adaptation. This was survival. The pressure, the darkness, the cold, it was simply testing the limits, revealing latent capability. She watched carefully as the sensors recorded every heartbeat, every tremor, every strain on the submarine and on Glacian's form, convinced that what she was witnessing was the beginning of something extraordinary, not catastrophic. But the shadows around them were heavier now, and Glacian's breaths grew shorter and sharper. Rhea's rational mind ticked through calculations even as her intuition screamed warnings she refused to acknowledge. The faint hum of ghostly currents whispered against the hull, unseen but present, and for a moment, she felt the abyss pressing its gaze into the small vessel. The water was colder here, denser, and still the numbers claimed safety. Yet the unease in her chest refused to dissipate. She stroked Glacian's head, murmuring, "We'll be fine," as if saying it enough could make the words true. And somewhere deep beneath that conviction, the first fractures of reality were beginning to form, like tiny splinters of ice along the edge of a fragile surface. The submarine quivered slightly as Rhea adjusted the depth controls, the water around them pressing in with a subtle but unmistakable weight. She checked the readouts again, all systems normal, hull integrity uncompromised. And yet, Glacian shivered violently in its harness, ears flat and eyes wide with something Rhea couldn't quite name. Ice crystals had begun forming along the edges of its fur, tiny fractures at first, almost imperceptible under the dim lighting of the cabin. Rhea reached out instinctively, running a hand along its spine, feeling the hardening beneath her touch. "It's okay," she murmured, the words more for herself than for her partner. "It's just the pressure. That's all." But even as she said it, her rational mind wavered, because this was no ordinary pressure, and this was no ordinary Glacian. The temperature sensors ticked downward, dropping faster than the environmental data should have allowed. A faint mist began curling from the small cracks in Glacian's ice, a ghostly haze that shimmered with the cabin lights. Rhea watched intense fascination as the fractures spider-webbed across its body, spreading in intricate patterns, yet somehow holding form. Every instinct screamed alarm, every part of her screaming to surface immediately, but she resisted. The numbers said safety, the reports, the schematics, her experience, they all insisted the submarine and its passenger were within limits. And yet, the reality before her eyes defied all expectation. Glacian trembled again, low, rattling shivers echoing through the cabin, and Rhea's hands gripped the console tightly. This, whatever it was happening despite her planning, despite her skill. The shivering intensified, and now the ice shards along Glacian's body began to fracture audibly, small pops and clicks that sounded like brittle glass under pressure. Rhea felt her chest tighten, but she refused to step back. She convinced herself that this was adaptation. Evolution. That the creature she had raised and trained was simply undergoing a transformation she could not yet comprehend. She replays the image in her mind of Abyss Ian, of the Alola dive, and tells herself this is the same stress creating life, pressure forcing a new form into being. She adjusted the submersible's angle slightly, monitoring the structural integrity of the cabin and Glacian alike, even as the fractures widened, forming long, jagged fissures across the Pokémon's once sleek fur. Then, the inevitable happened. One long, crystalline shard broke free entirely, clattering onto the cabin floor with a noise that sounded impossibly loud in the confined space. Glacian collapsed in the harness, its body trembling, still tethered by the spectral coherence of its icy form but clearly failing under the immense strain. Life signs spiked erratically on the monitor before flatlining, an unbroken line that should have shattered Ria's resolve completely. She refused to acknowledge it. Not now. Not ever. The spirit in Glacian's gaze, though faint, fractured, and glowing eerily, was enough for her to deny the truth. No, she whispered harshly, pressing her hands to the console, as if by sheer will she could force the body to survive. You're not gone. You're still here. You're still with me. The fractures on Glacian's body spread further, jagged and chaotic, yet somehow the creature did not dissolve. Ghostly blue energy shimmered along the ice shards, binding them together in patterns Ria could not rationalize. The Pokémon's form, though shattered, held against the crushing pressure of the deep, a stubborn, spectral refusal to let go of life. Ria's eyes filled with tears, but she could not name them grief. There was only wonder, horror, and the unyielding denial that her partner, the one she had trusted and loved, had perished in her hands. She adjusted the submersible's controls to maintain position, careful not to disturb the fragile equilibrium of shattered ice and ghostly energy, because she had made a choice: if Glacian could not live in its body, then it would live in spirit. She would not let the abyss claim what it had created. And so the submarine floated in the dark, 10 meters below the surface, a small bubble of light and machinery, holding a broken Pokémon that should have died entirely. Ria sat in the captain's chair, shaking, heart racing, and whispered the words that would bind her denial: hold on just a little longer. The cabin lights reflected faintly on the jagged shards, shimmering like the first glimmer of a new form. Somewhere in the deep, a new presence was beginning to take shape, born from fractures, ghostly resilience, and a bond too strong to sever. Ria did not yet know the name it would take, but she knew it would not be Glacian as she had once known it. The moment came with no fanfare, no dramatic eruption, just a quiet, impossible persistence. The jagged shards of ice that had once been Glacian trembled in the deep, fractured and fractured again, the energy flickering along their edges like the pulse of some hidden heartbeat. Ria could barely breathe, eyes wide and glued to the monitors, hands trembling on the console. The shards began to lift, slow and deliberate, as if held together by some invisible force stronger than the ocean's crushing weight. Ghostly blue light pulsed along the fractures, illuminating the cramped cabin with an otherworldly glow that made the dark waters beyond the submersible look impossibly deep. She swallowed hard, telling herself it was adaptation, that this was evolution, even as the truth clawed at her chest. Something had survived, yes, but it was not the same Glacian she had raised, and she knew it even as her mind rejected the fact. The energy binding the shattered body grew more coherent, a lattice of spectral currents wrapping around each shard and holding it in place. The ice, broken beyond what any natural repair could allow, refused to crumble entirely, and a form began to emerge, jagged yet fluid, spectral yet solid. Ria's heart raced in a way that was both exhilaration and terror. She could feel the pull of the deep, the unnatural pressure surrounding them, and the faint hum of life or something like life emanating from the creature before her. It raised its head slowly, hollow eyes glowing faintly like bioluminescent beacons, and Ria's tears fell freely, not of sorrow but of disbelief. You survived," she whispered, her voice trembling as if speaking the words aloud could somehow cement them into reality. She would not allow herself to mourn. The evidence of the monitors, the ice, the glow, everything told her she was staring at something new, something miraculous. The transformation was slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial in its pacing. The shards reformed into a recognizable body, elongated and more angular than before, edges sharp yet seamlessly held together by spectral energy that shimmered along the fissures like a living lattice. Its tail swept behind it in fluid arcs, fins extending outward in flowing, ghostly elegance. The cabin air seemed to pulse with cold, a chill that reached into Rhea's bones as if acknowledging the presence of this spectral evolution. Glacian's soft whimpers of pain had long ceased, replaced by a silent, haunting hum that resonated through the submersible. Rhea's rational mind fought back the gnawing truth that her best friend had perished under the weight of her own oversight. Instead, she clung to the undeniable fact: the spirit remained, tethered to the fractured ice and to her own resolve, refusing to let the abyss claim it entirely. She leaned closer, as if proximity could somehow explain the impossible. Cryonarch, she breathed, the name forming naturally on her lips even before she knew she had chosen it. It fit. Shattered, spectral, hauntingly beautiful. The Pokémon rose fully, the fractured shards now bound together in a stable form, ghostly mist curling in gentle eddies around its body. Every breath of water around them seemed to shift in deference, currents parting as if acknowledging the presence of something ancient and untouchable. Rhea's hands shook as she reached to touch the console, recording every reading, every flicker of spectral energy, every anomaly. She could not admit the truth, not fully, not yet. In her mind, Cryonarch was an evolution, a new form born of extreme conditions, a testament to the power of bond and survival. In her heart, she already knew the cost, but she refused to name it. The submersible floated in silence, the dark abyss pressing in all around, yet inside the cabin, a small sphere of impossible life glimmered and held form. Cryonarch's hollow eyes met hers briefly, a silent acknowledgement of the bond they shared, a testament to the trust that had survived the crushing depths. Rhea exhaled shakily, swallowing the grief she could not face and replacing it with determination. This was not a death. It was something new. Something that she could study, understand, and protect. Somewhere deep in her chest, a pang of guilt whispered that she had lost her friend, but she shoved it down, choosing to see only what she could control: the spectral, icebound Pokémon hovering beside her, alive in its own, impossible way. And with that, the abyss that had claimed Glacian felt a little less dark, a little less absolute, because Cryonarch remained, holding onto life and memory in a way that defied all logic. The ascent was slow, measured, each meter upward a reminder of the crushing pressure they had just escaped. The submersible creaked and groaned under the strain, sensors flickering as the cabin temperature climbed fractionally, yet Cryonarch remained composed, hovering beside Rhea with an eerie grace, shards of spectral ice glinting faintly in the dim cabin lights. The water outside darkened gradually, the abyss yielding to the shallower blues of the midwater zones, yet the ghostly glow of Cryonarch seemed unaffected by the light, a cold reminder that it was no ordinary evolution, no mere Pokémon shaped by pressure or biology. Rhea's hands danced over the controls, logging every detail, every reading, ensuring nothing of this impossible event went unrecorded. She refused to allow skepticism, denial, or grief to cloud her observations. This was engineering verification now, a test, a proof, and a witness all in one. Her heart raced as they broke the surface. The first rays of evening sun struck the waves, scattering across the ocean in glimmers that seemed almost mundane after the ghostly luminance below. Cryonarch remained at her side, gliding effortlessly, water condensing slightly into mist around its jagged body. Rhea swallowed, staring at the creature that had once been Glacian, the creature whose soft whimpers and playful nudges had filled so many of her days, now bound in ice and spectral light, yet unmistakably alive. She could not call it death. To do so would be to deny the evidence of the glowing fractures, the subtle hum that pulsed like a heartbeat, or the way Cryonarch's hollow eyes followed her every movement with recognition. In her mind, it was a new life, a testament to bond, survival, and adaptation, and she clung to that narrative with the fierce stubbornness of someone unwilling to admit loss. Rhea guided the submersible toward the dock, taking care to avoid other vessels and giving Cryonarch the space it seemed to need. Every turn of the propeller, every gentle tilt of the cabin, she calculated against the ethereal movements of the icebound Pokémon, ensuring that the stress of ascent did not shatter the delicate balance that held its form together. She spoke quietly, more to herself than to the creature, "You made it. We made it." The words were half reassurance, half denial, but they carried an honesty she could not entirely escape. Instruments recorded the spectral energy readings, water temperature, ice integrity, and every anomaly that defied conventional understanding, yet all she could focus on was the presence of Cryonarch beside her. It was alive, it was real, and it had survived something that should have destroyed it entirely. As they approached the dock, the glow of Cryonarch began to catch the eyes of the workers milling about, who stopped mid-task, gawking at the strange, jagged Pokémon suspended just above the water line. Rhea's jaw tightened. She had no time for explanations, no patience for awe. This was her responsibility, her discovery, and perhaps her only chance to ensure the creature remained protected from misunderstanding or from fear. She maneuvered carefully, docking the submersible without incident, while Cryonarch hovered, icy mist curling upward in a spectral haze. Cameras clicked, some trained on her, some on the impossible Pokémon, but Rhea only felt the weight of the moment. The creature was safe for now, and she had proof. She stepped out of the submersible, the cold air of the evening cling her skin in contrast to the warm ocean beneath, and whispered again, almost in defiance of the world, "You're alive. I'll make sure everyone sees that." Every fiber of her being rejected the idea that the spirit within the fractured ice had perished. This was survival. This was evolution. This was Cryonarch, and she would not call it anything else. Her first report would be meticulous. Environmental readings, spectral energy signatures, photographic evidence, and eyewitness accounts would all be catalogued. She would present them to the Kalos League with confidence, because in her mind, nothing she had seen or failed to prevent would diminish the truth of what remained before her. Cryonarch's light glimmered faintly as she recorded every detail, the ghostly shimmer reflecting off her wet hair and oil-streaked coveralls. It was a being born from the abyss, held together by will, bond, and spectral energy, and for Rhea, it was her own defiance of finality, her refusal to accept loss as a limit. As the evening deepened and the dock workers whispered among themselves in awe and disbelief, Rhea stood firm, resolute. She had seen the impossible, documented the miraculous, and returned to the world with something the world had not yet earned the right to understand. Cryonarch was alive, and she would carry that truth into any confrontation, any skepticism, any judgment that might come next. Rhea barely had time to steady herself on the dock before the Kalos League representatives arrived, their expressions precise masks of professional detachment that did nothing to hide the tension in the air. Data streams, submersible recordings, and photographs were laid out across the portable consoles she had brought, each one meticulously annotated with depth readings, pressure measurements, spectral energy logs, and the ghostly luminescence of Cryonarch itself. She spoke clearly, systematically, highlighting every anomaly that defied conventional science, every calculation that suggested adaptation, every glowing fracture that pulsed like a heartbeat trapped in ice. Cryonarch hovered beside her, silent yet palpable, its ethereal form cutting a striking silhouette against the fading orange light of the evening. To Rhea, this was evidence of survival, proof of evolution at the very edge of possibility. To the League, it was something far less comforting. The lead official adjusted their glasses and scrolled through the telemetry, frowning. "Commander Solane," they began, voice neutral but firm, "the scans show no biological life in this Pokémon. No heartbeat, no cellular activity, no metabolism. Whatever this is, it is not Glacian. It is not alive." A hush fell over the dock. Workers who had gathered to watch the submersible's return exchanged uneasy glances, some stepping back instinctively, as if the cold aura emanating from Cryonarch made the world around it less human, less forgiving. Ria's fingers tightened on the console, frustration and disbelief coiling within her like a living thing. "That's impossible," she said, forcing calm. "It's right here. It responds to me. It moves with intention. It's conscious. You're missing the point. It survived, against everything physics and biology would dictate." The officials shook their head, scrolling through additional scans that confirmed what Ria already feared would be their conclusion. "Commander, we cannot confirm life. We are classifying this as a hazardous anomaly. It exhibits no biological processes and possesses properties inconsistent with living Pokémon. Under League regulations, it is considered dangerous and must be contained immediately." Ria's stomach twisted. Dangerous. Contained. The words clawed at her, each one a challenge to everything she had seen with her own eyes. Cryonarch shifted slightly, shards of ice humming faintly with spectral energy, as if aware of the judgment being passed upon it, yet it made no aggressive move. It simply waited, tethered to her presence, as if understanding that she alone would stand between it and a fate it did not deserve. She pressed a hand against the console, refusing to let their definitions dictate reality. "You don't understand," she said firmly, the edge in her voice cutting through the cool evening air. "You're looking at life through instruments, through charts and readings, but you're blind to the evidence right in front of you. This is my partner. This is Cryonarch. It is alive. I saw it, I recorded it, I experienced it. You don't get to redefine my friend because your scanners don't recognize what survived the abyss." The officials exchanged glances, some frowning, some steepling fingers, clearly debating how far they could push without sparking outright conflict. One of them finally spoke, voice measured but final, "Commander Solane, under League authority, your judgment cannot override protocol. Cryonarch is to be secured, and you are hereby warned, any attempt to prevent containment will be considered obstruction and endangerment. You are advised to comply." Ria's chest tightened, her jaw locked, but she refused to step back. The icy mist curling from Cryonarch's body seemed to thicken around her, a silent assertion of presence, of defiance. "I won't," she said simply. It was not bravado, nor rebellion for its own sake, it was conviction. Cryonarch was alive, and she would not let the League erase its existence or label it an abomination. Every fiber of her being screamed at the injustice, the denial of life she had witnessed firsthand. As the officials prepared their containment measures, Ria turned to Cryonarch, meeting its hollow yet luminous eyes, and whispered, "They don't understand, but I do. We'll survive this." The creature's glow pulsed faintly in acknowledgement, shards of spectral ice vibrating with a subtle hum that seemed almost like a breath. Outside, the world remained unaware of the fragile miracle hovering in the failing light, and inside, Ria's resolve solidified, whatever the League decreed, whatever danger awaited, she and Cryonarch would not be separated. Survival was no longer optional, it was a declaration. By the next morning, the Kalos League had mobilized a formal response. Ria found herself sitting across from a panel of officials in a stark, metal-paneled hearing room, the weight of authority pressing down on her like the ocean depths she had just survived. Papers were stacked in neat columns on the table, printed copies of submersible logs, thermal and pressure readings, and reports from League specialists who had evaluated Cryonarch from a distance. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant and heated electronics, a sterile contrast to the chill still radiating from the ghostly Pokémon hovering obediently behind her. Cryonarch's form glowed softly, shards of ice casting fractured reflections across the walls, a silent reminder of everything the League refused to acknowledge. Ria's hands hovered over the documents, her fingers tracing the lines of data she had meticulously recorded, unwilling to let go of the evidence that proved the creature's survival. Every officer present watched her like she was a criminal before she had spoken a single word. The head official, a stern woman with gray-streaked hair and eyes sharpened by decades of enforcing League protocol, leaned forward and began enumerating the charges. "Commander Ria Solane," she said, voice cold and precise, "you are formally charged with theft of a Kalos League research submersible, conducting unauthorized experiments in deep-sea environments, and creating a hazardous Pokémon anomaly that cannot be classified as naturally occurring. Your actions violated regulations concerning Pokémon safety, equipment security, and experimental oversight." Each word landed like a hammer blow, and Ria felt a tightening in her chest as the implications began to crystallize. She had expected disbelief, perhaps reprimand, but not the full weight of criminal accusation. Her stomach turned as she realized the League intended not just to reprimand her but to seize Cryonorc and erase any record of what had happened in the abyss. The officials continued, methodically outlining the potential consequences: permanent revocation of submersible operating privileges, suspension from all Kalos League expeditions, and mandatory surrender of any experimental recordings. They spoke in precise language, referencing laws and codes that seemed abstract and distant, yet Ria felt their teeth in her very bones. Cryonorca's icy glow seemed to pulse in tandem with her heartbeat, shards of spectral ice quivering as though sensing the rising tension. The officers' expressions did not waver, but Ria could feel their unease as the Pokémon's presence expanded into the room, not aggressive, but undeniably otherworldly. She refused to acknowledge the fear or the warnings. To her, Cryonorc was alive, and their bond was proof that nothing in the League's statutes could define it otherwise. Ria finally spoke, voice steady though the air in her lungs was thick with adrenaline. "I did not steal that submarine to endanger anyone," she said, scanning the room with unflinching eyes. "I went to the depths to understand what happened, to preserve life. Glacian. Cryonorc survived because I stayed with it. Every calculation, every observation proves it is alive. You can scan it, you can classify it as an anomaly, you can threaten me with penalties, but that will not change what I saw with my own eyes. This is not a hazard, it is my responsibility, and I will not let you erase it." A silence fell over the room. Some of the officials shifted uneasily, papers rustling, glances exchanged, but no one dared interrupt. Cryonorca's presence was undeniable, the faint hum of ghostly energy wrapping around the metal walls, a cold counterpoint to the heat of bureaucracy pressing down. The lead official's jaw tightened. "Commander, your defiance only solidifies the need for containment. Cryonorc will be secured, and you will face prosecution for all violations. Non-compliance will result in immediate escalation, including the deployment of enforcement personnel to retrieve the submersible and the Pokémon." The words were precise, final, and calculated to strip away any illusion of negotiation. Ria's hands curled into fists, nails biting into her palms, but her gaze never left the glowing form of Cryonorc. "Then I'll face it," she said quietly, almost to herself, "because you are not taking it from me. You are not taking them." She could feel the cold, spectral ice threading through the room, a protective mantle that defied every law, every rule, every definition of life. Whatever the League decreed, Ria knew she would stand between them and Cryonorc, because the bond they shared was unbreakable, forged in the abyss, sealed by survival beyond death. The Kalos League's enforcement team arrived mid-afternoon, clad in deep-sea-resistant suits and carrying specialized containment equipment designed for anomalies they barely understood. Ria met them at the dock, Cryonorc gliding beside her like a sentinel, its fractured ice form shimmering with ghostly light that refracted across the water in shards of azure and silver. The officers spoke through comms, issuing a series of precise, clipped instructions to step aside and surrender the Pokémon, their voices echoing against the metal hulls of the nearby research vessels. Ria's stomach churned, not from fear, but from the raw, urgent need to protect the creature that had once been her Glacian. She knew the League didn't see what she saw, the fragments of her best friend, still conscious, still bound to her presence, still alive in a form the world had no language for. Every step the officers took seemed to accelerate Cryonorca's awareness, the ghostly aura pulsing stronger, reacting to the intrusion like a living tide of spectral ice. When the first containment drone descended, sensors extended to detect life forms and immobilize them. Cryonic reacted almost instantly. A wave of freezing cold erupted outward, not violent, but overwhelming, sending frost blooming across the dockside surfaces, crystallizing puddles into jagged mirrors, coating metal railings with a sheen of glacial glass. The officers paused, boots slipping on frozen edges, breath visible even through their suit filters, voices cracking with surprise as temperature readings plummeted. Ria's heart raced, not from panic but from awe tinged with terror. This was not aggression in the usual sense. Cryonic was defending, reacting with a precision and awareness that spoke to the bond they shared. The Pokémon's ice shards spun outward in spiraling arcs, shimmering with ghostly light, creating a protective lattice that reflected sensors and cameras, rendering the drone's guidance systems useless. Ria stepped carefully, her hands guiding her movements so as not to provoke the creature further, whispering softly, "Steady, stay with me, you're safe." The League attempted to approach, sending multiple officers forward, but the cold spread faster than their advance, coating their boots and the lower hulls of their submersibles in frost. Glaciers formed around tether lines and docking cranes, forcing a retreat as the temperature sensors on their suits began to flash warnings of critical exposure. Cryonic remained calm in the chaos, gliding silently above the frost, shards spinning gently like shards of a frozen halo, the ghostly mist curling around its frame in protective arcs. Its luminous eyes tracked each movement of the humans, calculating, predicting, reacting not blindly, but with a methodical intelligence that mirrored Ria's own tactical instincts. She realized, in a way that chilled her even more than the ghostly cold, that Cryonic was not just defending itself, it was defending her, understanding instinctively that she was in danger from the very people who were supposed to uphold law and order. As the League's squad scrambled, trying to regain a foothold on the frozen dock, Ria seized the moment. She activated the submersible's engines, the whine of machinery blending with the low hum of Cryonic's icebound aura. With careful precision, she guided the craft into the water, Cryonic floating just above, shards glinting like frozen sentinels in the dim light. The ice that had spread across the dock began to crack and fracture under the pressure of movement, releasing a cold mist that shrouded them, obscuring their retreat. The team could not advance, could not predict, could not contain what defied every law of biology, physics, and protocol. Ria felt a surge of protective instinct stronger than anything she had ever known. She leaned close to the console, speaking softly to the creature that had once been her friend, her voice a tether across life and death. "They don't understand, they can't take you from me." The submersible slipped beneath the surface, Cryonic moving alongside, the ghostly glow fading into the dark currents, leaving behind only frozen chaos and the stunned, frustrated officers on the dock. The world above continued in disbelief, but below, in the dark, crushing depths, a bond endured that no League regulation, no enforcement squad, no scientific principle could sever. Ria exhaled slowly, her hands still tight on the submersible controls, feeling Cryonic's presence wrap around her like a shield forged in ice and spirit. They were fugitives now, but she could not care for that. Survival, understanding, and loyalty were all that mattered. For the first time, she understood fully that Cryonic had not merely survived, it had transcended, and she was bound to protect that transcendence at all costs. The submersible cut through the midnight waters like a shadow, its hull groaning under the weight of the deep, the dim console lights reflecting in Ria's tense eyes. Cryonic moved alongside, gliding silently through the dark abyss, shards of fractured ice trailing ghostly streams that glimmered like faint stars against the inky sea. The League's broadcasts and alerts had already labeled her actions criminal, but in the quiet darkness beneath the waves, there were no rules, only the pressing reality of survival. Ria's hands were steady on the controls, her mind focused not on fear, but on calculation. Every maneuver, every shift in depth, every adjustment to the submersible systems was designed to keep Cryonic safe, to keep them both alive. The icy currents tugged at the vessel, but she welcomed the resistance. It reminded her that the ocean was alive, unpredictable, and that she and her companion were a part of it now. Above, the League's pursuit was relentless but disorganized. Sensors pinged occasionally against the hull, sonar pulses cutting through the water in blind bursts, but Cryonarch's presence interfered subtly, ghostly cold and spectral energy masking their signatures. Rhea watched the monitors carefully, noting the way the creature's fractured body emitted faint glimmers that scattered light, refracted signals, and cloaked their movements in an almost supernatural haze. She could not allow herself to think about the cost, about the part of Glacian that had truly died and remained only in spectral memory. Denial had become her anchor, the one thing that allowed her to treat Cryonarch as a living evolution rather than a ghost born from tragedy. Every fiber of her being insisted that her friend had survived, that the bond they shared was enough to defy the laws that the League, science, and nature had attempted to impose. As the vessel navigated a narrow underwater canyon, Rhea felt the familiar tremor of pressure shifts against the hull, the crushing depths pressing in like the weight of the world itself. Cryonarch adjusted instinctively, shards of ice rotating, glimmering as if sensing the safest path. She marveled at the intelligence, the awareness, and the loyalty radiating from the creature, trying desperately to reconcile it with the truth she refused to acknowledge, that this form existed because Glacian had been broken. She whispered softly, a thread of reassurance weaving between life and spectral echo, "You survived, you made it. I won't let them take you away." The words hung in the water like frozen mist, a vow neither the depths nor the League could touch. They moved deeper, into uncharted trenches where sunlight could not reach and sensors could barely maintain a reading. The cold thickened, the water almost viscous with the ghostly presence surrounding them, but Rhea felt only a fierce clarity. She was no longer merely a mechanic or expedition leader, she was the guardian of something that the world could not categorize, a fugitive with a companion that straddled life and death. In the dark, silent depths, she allowed herself a brief moment to glance at Cryonarch, its luminous eyes reflecting hers, understanding and acknowledging, if not speaking, the bond that had become unbreakable. There were no other choices, no compromises, only the ocean, the cold, and the promise that she would carry this secret and this living ghost as far as necessary. Somewhere above, alarms blared, and the League's pursuit intensified, but here, in the crushing abyss where the rules of the surface held no power, Rhea felt an uneasy triumph. They were free, for now, and she would not allow Cryonarch to be taken, examined, or destroyed. She tightened her grip on the submersible's controls and spoke again, barely above a whisper, "We're not done yet, not by a long shot." The ghostly mist trailing from Cryonarch's shattered ice form curled around the vessel like a protective shroud, a spectral warning to anyone who dared follow. They had crossed the line from explorer to outlaw, but in that line, Rhea felt the truth of survival and loyalty, even broken, even altered beyond recognition. Some bonds were too powerful to be severed by the world above.